Winter arrived early in the year 1887, settling over a small frontier settlement pressed against the northern timberline. Snow had fallen before the ground fully hardened, sealing the earth in a crust that rang beneath boots and tools. Smoke rose thin from scattered cabins, each built by habit and repetition, each trusting walls of timber alone to keep the cold at bay. In that place lived Elias Morland, 19 years of age, recently established on his own parcel of land and watched closely by those who had endured many winters before him. If the whispers of the mountains call to you, subscribe, share, and follow Elias's journey, and witness quiet strength and survival in the heart of the high peaks. The settlement had no formal square, but men gathered where work paused. It was there that Elias's plan first became known. Instead of stacking more logs or raising his roofline, he hauled fieldstone from the edge of the forest and began setting it into a trench cut tight against his cabin walls. He worked in silence, placing stone below the frost line, packing earth back over it until the wall disappeared beneath the soil. The idea was received with open doubt. Neighbors stopped to watch, some shaking their heads, others offering brief remarks meant more to amuse than instruct. One older homesteader spoke plainly, saying the ground itself would steal whatever warmth the stones might hold. Another laughed that Elias was building for moles, not men. Their voices carried easily in the clear, cold air, unsoftened by sympathy. Elias did not answer them. He measured, lifted, and set each stone with steady pace. His hands cracked and bled as the days shortened, and the trench froze faster than he could widen it. Each evening he returned to a cabin that was unfinished by local standards, its walls lower, its shape unfamiliar. The stone wall remained buried, unseen, giving no sign of purpose. Weather signs grew less forgiving. Geese passed low and silent. The creek iced over in a single night. Older residents noted the weight of the sky and the way sound carried farther in the cold. They spoke quietly among themselves about storms that had broken men and split beams. None believed a hidden wall would matter when real winter came. As Elias worked, the settlement's authority figure, a land agent responsible for inspections, paused once at the edge of the trench. He asked only whether the work would delay completion. When told it would not, he offered no approval and moved on. The absence of encouragement spoke clearly enough. By the time the first true freeze arrived, laughter had faded into expectation. Most assumed the experiment would end the same way others had, with a lesson learned too late. No one imagined that beneath the frozen ground, stone and soil were already preparing an answer. Cold settled deeper each night, pressing inward without mercy. Nails shrank, doors stiffened, and breath lingered indoors. The settlement waited for failure, not with malice, but with certainty born of memory, counting weeks until storms would decide what laughter had not, and cold would make judgment final. Elias Morland had grown up within sight of the same tree line that now bordered his claim. His father had worked timber for wages, his mother tending a small plot that rarely produced more than necessity. When Elias took his own land at 19, there was no celebration. He brought a borrowed axe, a hand saw with missing teeth, and habits learned by watching rather than asking. He spoke little, rose before light, and worked until tools failed or darkness made mistakes likely. Those who observed him noted the absence of haste. He measured twice before cutting, stacked materials out of weather, and kept his cabin smaller than most. It was not thrift alone. He seemed to account for weight, wind, and time in a way that did not invite explanation. The buried stone wall became part of this pattern. Elias did not describe it as improvement or defense. He referred to it once, briefly, as balance. The land agent returned during the second week of work. He checked boundary stakes and footing depth, tapping frozen soil with his boot. He asked why stone was being placed where it could not be seen. Elias answered that frost traveled, and that stone did not. The agent paused, then said only that earth was colder than air. He marked his ledger and advised finishing before heavier snow. Others offered their opinions more freely. One neighbor remarked that logs had served well enough for 50 years. Another suggested the stones would draw damp into the walls. Elias listened without response, continuing to set each piece flush and tight. When asked how long the work would take, he replied that it would take as long as it needed. Days shortened. Snow thickened. Elias carried stone until his shoulders stiffened and his hands lost feeling. He ate sparingly, favoring heat over fullness. Each evening he checked the trench, testing for heave, adjusting where ground shifted. Nothing about the work suggested invention. It appeared closer to correction, as though something long neglected was being set right by steady labor and quiet judgment alone, without instruction or visible approval from those around him. Inside the settlement, preparation followed familiar lines. Extra firewood was stacked, cracks were stuffed with cloth and moss. The buried wall was spoken of less often, not because belief had grown, but because winter demanded attention elsewhere. Elias's cabin remained quiet, its door fitted tight, its roof low against the wind. Near the end of the month, the land agent passed again. He noted the trench filled and tamped. He said the ground would soon lock hard. Elias nodded and returned to his work. There was nothing further to discuss. At night, the sound of wind along the stones was muted by earth. Frost traced the ground above the trench, but did not penetrate deeply. Such details went unnoticed by most, yet Elias observed them without remark. Storing the knowledge for use rather than explanation, when colder days would demand certainty and further confirmation quietly. Those following this record may choose to support its continuation by subscribing or sharing. Such attention helps preserve careful accounts of early survival. By the time early winter settled fully over the settlement, routine began to narrow. Snow fell in smaller, steadier amounts, no longer startling, but persistent enough to erase tracks by morning. Elias Morland continued work around his cabin, while others turned inward, focusing on repairs already understood. He finished setting the final stones, packed soil tight, and banked earth against the lower walls until the ground met timber without gap. Tools stiffened with frost. Axes rang duller, saws bit slower, and fingers lost feeling before tasks were complete. Elias adjusted his pace, working shorter spans and returning inside to warm his hands before they failed entirely. Each day ended earlier, not by choice, but by light. The sun dropped behind the ridge before afternoon was done, leaving only blue shadow and cold air that burned the lungs. Across the settlement, preparation followed patterns proven by loss. Firewood was split smaller and stacked higher. Roofs were weighted with poles. Smoke thickened as damp logs were burned rather than risk exposure searching farther out. Men spoke less while working, saving breath, conserving strength. No one came to observe Elias now. The novelty of his buried wall had passed, replaced by assumption. A pair of neighbors paused once at the boundary fence. They noted the shallow pitch of Elias's roof and the absence of extra timber along his walls. One said the cabin would bleed heat. The other replied that some lessons required winter to teach them. Neither crossed the line. They turned back toward their own chores, leaving Elias to his silence. Snowfall increased near the end of the month. Drifts formed unevenly, driven by wind that shifted without warning. Paths narrowed. The creek vanished under white, its sound reduced to a dull movement beneath ice. Elias broke through crust once while hauling water, soaking one boot. He dried it by the hearth and returned to work the next morning without comment. Inside his cabin, changes were subtle. The floor stayed firm near the walls. Frost traced higher on windows elsewhere, but halted low where stone lay buried beneath earth. Elias noticed, marking it only by memory. He did not speak of it when the land agent passed briefly, noting progress with a glance before moving on. There were more urgent matters to attend across the settlement. Distance grew without open conflict. Meals were taken separately. Shared labor paused as weather shortened days. Expectations settled quietly. Most believed Elias would be forced to alter his cabin once true cold arrived, if he managed at all. The buried wall was no longer mentioned. It was already considered a failed idea, awaiting proof through consequence rather than argument. Evenings closed in with routine precision. Elias checked stored grain, counted remaining candles, and set aside kindling where it could be reached without delay. He listened to wind along the tree line and noted how snow pressed differently against earth and timber. Outside, other cabins showed frost creeping lower each night. Doors swelled, hinges shrieked. Small failures accumulated quietly, accepted as normal cost. No one spoke of adjustment or experiment. Winter was treated as fixed law, not condition. Elias prepared within that law, conserving motion, keeping tasks simple, and waiting without haste for the season to reveal which choices would endure. Nothing in the settlement suggested mercy, only endurance measured by cold, fuel, and time alone, quietly, steadily, through weeks ahead of deep winter. By the first morning when breath froze in beards and water skins iced solid overnight, winter had made its position clear. Elias secured his door, checked seams, and banked the last loose snow against the walls. He worked alone, unnoticed, as doubt hardened alongside the ground, preparing to outlast either effort or intention. Cold arrived without warning, dropping overnight to a depth that changed routine immediately. Water froze solid in buckets left too near doors. Iron rang sharp and brittle when struck. The settlement woke to a stillness that carried weight, as though sound itself resisted travel through the air. Smoke from chimneys fell low and straight, signaling cold that pressed downward rather than moving on. Cabins that had held through earlier weeks began to lose ground. Frost crept inward along wall seams and pooled beneath beds. Fires demanded constant tending, and fuel disappeared faster than expected. Men rose twice each night to feed stoves, careful not to let flame fade long enough for cold to take hold. By morning, ash piles were deep, and hands shook from lack of rest. Elias Morland felt the change as well. His breath clouded indoors, but less than he had anticipated. He tested walls with his palm, noting where cold traveled fastest. Near the floor, along the buried stones, the timber held firm. Earth packed tight against the cabin resisted the freeze longer than exposed logs. The stone wall's position beneath the frost line became central to his attention, though its effect remained incomplete and unspoken. Elsewhere, the consequences were clearer. Mrs. Halden, the settlement's oldest resident, lived alone in a narrow cabin built years earlier by her late son. Age had reduced her strength, and she moved carefully to conserve it. On the first hard morning, her door froze shut. A neighbor freed it with an axe handle and found ice along the inside wall, creeping toward her pallet. She said only that the night had been long. Wood was carried for her, cut smaller to fit her hearth. Even so, the heat escaped quickly. Blankets were doubled. Her breath showed inside by midday. No one spoke of relocation. Space was scarce and illness feared. The settlement accepted the risk quietly, measuring days by how well the weak endured them. The land agent moved through the cabins, checking for collapse risk and supply shortfall. He paused at Elias's doorway longer than before. Inside, the fire burned low but steady. The floor near the walls was cold, but not frozen. He asked whether extra fuel was needed. Elias said it was not, and offered no further explanation. The agent marked his ledger and left without comment. Wind followed the cold. It probed gaps, lifted loose snow, and pressed drifts hard against structures. Nails shrank, boards pulled apart, and doors warped. Elias spent one morning resetting his latch, then returned to waiting. He did not add timber or cloth to his walls. He watched frost patterns instead, noting where they stalled and where they advanced. Mrs. Halden's condition worsened with the second night of deep cold. Her voice weakened, and she remained seated near the hearth. Neighbors took turns checking on her, leaving quickly to preserve their own heat. Elias passed once, carrying water. He stopped only long enough to set the bucket within reach and adjust the hearthstones. He said nothing and moved on. By the fourth day, the settlement understood that this cold would not lift soon. Fires burned day and night. Food grew plain. Conversation narrowed to practical matters. Elias's cabin drew brief notice as smoke rose steadily, unbroken by frantic feeding. No claim was made, no proof offered. The stone wall remained buried, its influence present only in small differences measured by frost, fuel, and fatigue. Cold held firm, testing every choice made before winter began. Some cabins lost the fight inch by inch. Others endured at cost. Elias remained watchful, neither confident nor doubtful, allowing the freeze to do its work and reveal, in time, what patience and placement beneath the ground might truly mean. Nights lengthened further, and stars burned hard above the settlement, offering no warmth. Each morning began with counting losses, cracked pails, split rails, frozen hinges. Elias added these observations to his own, understanding that winter kept careful record and would soon compare them without bias or mercy, in full. By midwinter, the cold no longer announced itself. It simply remained, pressing without pause. Days blurred into one another as temperatures stayed low enough that thaw became a forgotten concept. Snow compacted into hard layers that held weight. Wind polished exposed wood to a dull sheen. The settlement adjusted its rhythm again, cutting movement to what was necessary and no more. Structural weaknesses began to show. One cabin lost a corner where logs had shrunk unevenly, leaving a seam that no amount of cloth could seal. Another sagged at the roofline as rafters bowed under accumulated snow. Repairs were attempted in brief windows of daylight, fingers numbing before tasks could be finished. Each fix bought time, not comfort. Fuel became the measure of survival. Woodpiles dwindled faster than planned. Men spoke in short exchanges about remaining cords and the distance to the next stand of timber. One warned another to watch for pale skin on cheeks and ears. Frostbite was discussed without alarm, treated as a calculation rather than a fear. Livestock suffered quietly. A goat froze its water trough solid overnight and refused to drink until ice was broken. Chickens stopped laying and huddled together, feathers fluffed against the cold. Losses were noted without ceremony. The settlement had endured such winters before, though not without cost. Elias Morland's cabin remained unchanged in appearance. Its roofline stayed low, its walls unadorned. Smoke rose steadily, neither thick with waste nor thin with neglect. Inside, the fire was kept modest. The floor near the walls stayed firm, not rimed with ice. Fuel was consumed more slowly than expected, enough that Elias set aside a small reserve, rather than burning it immediately. Neighbors noticed this without comment. One man, hauling a sled of wood past Elias's place, paused only to ask how much fuel had been used that week. Elias answered with a number. The man nodded once and moved on, making his own adjustments without further question. Mrs. Halden was moved closer to her hearth as her strength waned. A bench was set near the fire so she need not rise often. Elias brought wood once, splitting it smaller so it would catch quickly. She thanked him with a nod. No other words were needed. The land agent returned during a stretch of clear, bitter days. He noted which cabins smoked continuously and which did not. At Elias's door, he asked whether the cold had forced changes. Elias replied that the walls held. The agent looked down at the packed earth along the base and said nothing more. Wind continued to test every gap. Snow pressed hard against exposed logs elsewhere, melting slightly where heat escaped, then freezing into ridges of ice. Elias's cabin showed less of this. Snow remained dry along the lower walls, indicating colder exterior surfaces and less loss within. The buried walls effect surfaced quietly through such signs. At night, the settlement grew darker as candles were rationed. Fires were banked carefully to last until morning. Elias slept in short intervals, rising once to adjust the fire, then returning to rest. His hands cracked, his face weathered, but he did not lose sensation. Others were not as fortunate. A neighbor lost feeling in 2 fingers while cutting wood and wrapped them in cloth soaked with warm grease. Another slipped on ice and bruised a hip badly enough to limit movement for days. These incidents were noted and absorbed into routine. Reminders that winter demanded payment for every mistake. Conversation remained practical. Men compared notes on animal feed, on snow depth, on which trails remained passable. Elias listened more than he spoke. When asked whether his cabin stayed warmer, he replied only that it stayed steady. By the end of the month, the settlement understood that not all shelters endured equally. No one spoke of buried walls or new methods. They spoke instead of fuel saved, of nights slept through without rising, of floors that did not freeze. Elias's cabin became one reference among many, its stability recorded through consequence alone, as winter continued its work without pause or judgment. Such differences mattered now, when weeks stretched long and recovery was unlikely, and each small advantage reduced strain on bodies already tired. Preserving strength needed for the colder weeks still ahead that everyone knew were coming soon enough now. By the 3rd week of January, the cold deepened into something that no longer varied. It held through daylight and darkness alike, sinking lower each night until even seasoned residents remarked on its persistence. The settlement marked this stretch as the coldest week, not by record, but by effect. Breath froze into dense clouds indoors. Water set near fires filmed with ice by morning. Time itself seemed to slow as every task required more care. Cabins that had endured earlier cold began to fail. Frost formed along ceiling joints and dropped fine crystals onto bedding. Ice climbed from floors toward shelves, sealing stored jars in place. Fires burned continuously, yet rooms remained sharp and dry with cold. Men slept in shifts, rising to tend flames before embers died. Fuel vanished at an alarming rate, measured now in days rather than weeks. Elias Morland's routine changed little. He rose before light, adjusted the fire once, and waited for warmth to spread slowly. His breath showed, but less so near the walls. Ice gathered at the center of the floor, but stopped short of the packed earth at the edges. A bucket left overnight near the wall did not freeze solid, forming only a skin that broke easily. Elias noted this and moved on. Comparisons began without intention. A neighbor stepped inside Elias's cabin briefly to deliver a message from the land agent. He stamped his feet once and remarked that the floor felt firm. Elias replied only that the fire had been low all night. The man nodded, looking around before leaving quickly to preserve his own heat. Outside, the cold left visible record. Nails popped from beams with sharp reports. Trees cracked in the forest after sunset. Snow squeaked underfoot, dry and brittle. At Mrs. Halden's cabin, ice formed thick along the interior wall despite constant fire. Her breath showed in steady rhythm as she sat wrapped near the hearth. Wood was fed often, yet warmth did not linger. The land agent returned during this week, making rounds with greater attention. He stepped carefully, testing steps for ice, noting which doors resisted opening. At Elias's place, he paused longer than before. He watched the smoke, steady and pale. Inside, he observed frost lines and checked the floor with his boot. He asked how much fuel had been burned since the cold set in. Elias answered with a figure lower than expected. The agent wrote it down. No declarations were made. Instead, measurements accumulated. Men compared how long fires lasted through the night. They noted where ice formed first and where it retreated last. They observed how quickly breath fogged and how long it took to clear. In Elias's cabin, condensation froze higher on the windows, but remained absent along the lower walls. The buried stone and earth beneath the frost line held their position quietly. Livestock losses mounted elsewhere. A calf weakened after a night without sufficient shelter. Chickens froze where drafts found them. Elias lost none, having moved his small stock closer to the ground and shielded them with earth-backed walls. He said nothing about it when asked, only that they were still standing. As the week progressed, skepticism gave way to attention. Neighbors did not praise or question. They looked, counted, and adjusted. One man shifted snow away from his own cabin base, another banked earth where he could. These actions followed observation, not instruction. On the final night of the coldest stretch, the temperature fell further still. Fires were stoked carefully across the settlement. Elias fed his once and slept until morning. When dawn came, ice lay thick on exposed surfaces, yet inside his cabin, the fire still held. The floor at the walls remained unfrozen. Fuel remained stacked. By week's end, the comparison no longer required words. The buried walls effect stood proven through routine survival. Opinion had no place left. Winter had measured each choice impartially, and the record lay in fuel saved, sleep gained, and structures that held when others strained. The land agent closed his ledger on Elias's entry without comment, his skepticism resolved by observation alone, as the cold slowly loosened its grip, leaving behind clear evidence written in ice, ash, and endurance. No celebration followed, and no lesson was announced. The settlement simply adjusted its understanding, storing the knowledge alongside others learned by hardship. Elias continued as before, neither watched nor doubted now, as the cold eased slightly, having delivered its verdict without noise, drama, or mercy, and moved on. Winter left nothing uncertain, only differences recorded where careful choices endured. After the coldest week passed, the settlement did not return to ease. Snow remained deep, and nights stayed long, but the sharpest edge had dulled. People moved again between cabins, slower than before, carrying habits altered by what they had seen. Repairs began where hands allowed, not to improve comfort, but to prevent collapse during what remained of winter. Nothing was discussed openly. Yet understanding shifted in small decisions made without meeting or agreement. Winter building was reconsidered quietly, guided by observation rather than tradition alone. Earth, stone, and placement entered thought where logs once dominated. No one named the change, but it held. It would shape work for weeks ahead, without ceremony or remark, through shared silence, together now. Elias Morland did not receive visits or praise. His routine remained unchanged, rising before light, feeding the fire once, and turning to tasks outside while weather allowed. Neighbors watched from a distance, noting what he did not add as much as what he had built. Questions were replaced by imitation, cautious and incomplete. He offered no explanation when tools paused near his door, and he gave no advice. Work continued as winter permitted. Steady and limited, the buried wall was never mentioned by him. It existed only in effect, not speech. Such restraint carried weight among people accustomed to proof. They respected silence earned by endurance. Nothing further followed. Yet, changes appeared first around Mrs. Halden. Her cabin was banked with additional earth brought quietly from nearby slopes. Stone was stacked low along the base, not deep, but enough to slow the cold. Fires lasted longer, and ice withdrew from the inner wall by small degrees. She slept through more nights without waking, conserving strength. Neighbors noted the difference without comment. The benefit was measured in breath and movement, not gratitude. Elias assisted when needed, carrying wood or earth, then leaving. No discussion followed these acts. They were practical responses to weather. The settlement accepted them as such. Survival required less talk and more adjustment. This was understood by all. As weeks passed, subtle shifts spread. Snow was cleared away from cabin bases before it melted and refroze. Earth was piled where ground allowed. Logs were set tighter, lower, and closer to soil. These changes were uneven and incomplete, but they reflected attention newly sharpened. No one sought instruction from Elias. They relied on memory from observation. Winter remained the instructor, firm and impartial. Cabins adjusted slowly, some benefiting, others too late. Losses still occurred, though fewer than feared. The settlement endured with less strain than before. Elias remained one presence among many. He was neither elevated nor isolated. His work spoke adequately. No more was required. By season's end, the aftermath settled without ceremony. Winter continued, but understanding had shifted beneath it. Elias prepared for spring, as he had prepared for cold, quietly and alone. What endured was not a method, but the knowledge that ground, patience, and careful placement could mean the difference between lasting and failing. That lesson remained with those who survived. It would be recalled when winter returned again, without name, credit, or dispute, simply as experience earned through cold. The season moved forward accordingly, leaving no doubt behind, for those still standing, afterward, quietly. Years later, when the settlement had grown beyond its first uncertain lines, the winter of 1887 was recalled only in fragments. Roofs were higher now, cabins more numerous, and paths better worn. Yet one feature near the edge of the old timberline remained unchanged. Elias Morland's cabin still sat low to the ground, its stonework hidden beneath earth, its outline modest among newer structures. Those who had lived through that winter spoke of it rarely. When they did, they referred not to Elias himself, but to the cold that had tested them. One such witness was a man who had been a boy then, tasked with hauling water and clearing snow. He remembered how breath froze inside some cabins and not in others. He remembered counting logs before nightfall and listening for cracks in the dark. He recalled Elias's place as quiet, neither warmer by fire nor louder with effort. The stone wall was not discussed as an invention. No one claimed it as a method to be taught or improved. It was remembered as a condition, like a ridge that blocked wind or a hollow that held snow. The ground beneath the frost line became part of local knowledge, passed on without name. When new cabins were built, earth was considered differently. Stones were placed lower. Floors were kept closer to soil. These choices were made without reference, guided by memory shaped under pressure. Elias Morland did not remain long at the center of settlement life. He worked his land, added little, and aged as others did. His cabin endured seasons beyond that winter, requiring fewer repairs than expected. This fact was noted, then accepted. Over time, the buried wall ceased to be remarkable. It simply remained, doing its work unseen. Mrs. Halden did not survive many winters after that one, but she lived through it with less suffering than feared. Her final years were marked by steadier nights and fewer emergencies. Those who remembered her associated that with care taken during the cold, not with any single person's idea. Survival was understood as collective adjustment, shaped by environment more than intent. When the witness spoke of that winter later, he did not praise foresight or condemn doubt. He said only that the cold had taught them where warmth stayed and where it fled. The lesson endured because it had been learned slowly through days that allowed no mistake. What remained was patience, attention, and an acceptance that land answered honestly when given time without argument or mercy.